They started as 9 poor monks protecting pilgrims, but rose to become the medieval world's deadliest military force and first multinational corporation. Here is the true story of how the Knights Templar invented modern banking, challenged kings, and ultimately vanished in a storm of conspiracy and fire. Out of the Middle Ages came the Knights Templar, one of the most mysterious groups ever known. They formed right after the chaotic First Crusade, starting as a tiny squad of soldiers. Their goal was simple: guard pilgrims traveling the risky paths to Jerusalem. It is incredible to look at how they changed from modest guardians into a massive power that could pressure popes and kings. These fighting monks held a unique status, skipping over feudal laws to answer strictly to the pope. Their signature white cloaks featuring red crosses were famous all over the Middle East and Europe, creating a reputation of both fear and respect. In only a few decades, they expanded from a small brotherhood into a high-level organization that mixed combat skills with new financial methods. The order existed for almost 2 centuries. From 1119 to 1312 AD, their timeline overlaps with the Crusades, the birth of banking, and the power struggles between the Islamic world and Europe. Their downfall is equally famous, involving a political plot full of heresy charges, secret trials, and executions. Their tale is so gripping because it highlights the paradoxes of medieval faith. They were poor monks who became incredibly rich, and defenders of Christendom who made deals with Muslim leaders. Yet, in a cruel twist of irony, the very European powers they served would eventually become their greatest enemies. But let's rewind to the year 1119 AD. 9 French knights stood before King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a bold, unprecedented idea. They proposed a unique type of religious order, a moment that would forever change the face of medieval finance, politics, and warfare. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. To understand the origins of the legendary Knights Templar, however, we first have to look at the world that created them. The late 11th century was a time of massive transformation. Europe stood at a major crossroads of faith, power, and ambition. To get the full picture of how this revolutionary military order emerged, you have to understand the complex landscape of the time. It was a continent defined by the feudal system, a dominant church, and a growing obsession with the Holy Land. Medieval society operated on the feudal ladder, a structure built on duties and protection. Monarchs sat at the very top, but in reality, their power was often quite limited. The real muscle belonged to influential nobles who controlled huge territories. They managed networks of vassals who promised to fight for them in exchange for land and safety. This shattered political map meant that competing interests were always clashing, making violence and turf wars a standard part of daily life. The one thing holding this fragmented continent together was the Catholic Church. By the end of the 1000s, it had evolved into the most powerful organization in Western Europe. The Cluniac reforms from previous decades had successfully separated the Church from secular control and centralized authority under the Pope. Religious doctrine touched every single part of medieval life, influencing everyone from the king in his court to the peasant in the field. Christian teachings were the lens through which Europeans viewed the world and their place in it. Between 1073 and 1085, Pope Gregory VII pushed this dominance even further. He led the Church during the Investiture controversy, a major showdown where religious authorities claimed supremacy over secular rulers. While the fight was technically about who had the right to appoint church officials, it was really a battle over who was truly in charge, the spirit or the state. The ultimate symbol of this power shift happened in 1077 at Canossa, where Emperor Henry IV reportedly stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days just to beg the Pope for forgiveness. Rome was clearly in the driver's seat. While Europe was going through these internal changes, a completely different civilization was flourishing across the Mediterranean. In the 11th century, the Islamic world was at the peak of its achievement. From Baghdad to Cordoba, Muslim scholars were miles ahead in fields like math, astronomy, medicine, and architecture. They were preserving and building upon ancient Greek knowledge while European societies were still playing catch-up. Jerusalem held deep spiritual meaning for Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike. For followers of Islam, it was the third most sacred site after Mecca and Medina, home to the magnificent Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Since the Arab conquest in the 7th century, Muslim rulers had generally allowed Christian pilgrims to visit these holy sites. But by the mid-11th century, the situation began to shift. Control of the Holy Land had passed to the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt, but regional stability crumbled when the Seljuk Turks arrived. The Seljuks, recent converts to Islam, were aggressively expanding their territory. In 1071, they crushed the Byzantine Empire at the Battle of Manzikert, a victory that completely changed the balance of power in the region. This Seljuk advance threatened the established pilgrimage routes and made the West extremely nervous about their access to sacred sites. For centuries, European Christians had made difficult journeys to Palestine as acts of deep devotion. These pilgrimages were spiritual quests and a way to do penance, with many believing that prayers offered at these holy locations brought special grace and forgiveness for sins. But by the late 11th century, these trips were becoming incredibly dangerous. Travelers didn't just have to worry about starvation, disease, and harsh weather. They also faced constant threats from bandits. Since pilgrims often carried valuable gifts for shrines, they were easy targets. Stories of Christians being mistreated, some real, some exaggerated, began circulating throughout Europe. These accounts found a willing audience on a continent that was already going through a religious revival. The idea of an armed pilgrimage, which combined religious devotion with military action, started to take root in the European mindset. It was against this backdrop that the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent messengers to Pope Urban II asking for military help against the Seljuk Turks. While the emperor was mainly worried about getting his land back, his request sparked something much bigger. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban delivered a speech that changed the course of history. Urban mixed religious passion with political strategy, calling on Christian warriors to stop fighting each other and unite to reclaim the holy city. Deus vult, or God wills it, became the rallying cry as thousands of men sewed crosses onto their clothes to symbolize their sacred vow. The Pope offered a huge spiritual reward, a plenary indulgence, promising that all punishment for their sins would be wiped away. For medieval people who were terrified of damnation, this was an incredible motivator. On top of that, the expedition gave the second sons of noble families, men who weren't going to inherit their family estates, a chance to win glory, wealth, and territory in a distant land. The result was the First Crusade, a massive military campaign that began in 1096. After a disastrous initial attempt known as the People's Crusade ended in a massacre, the main army of French and Norman knights departed in August. Against huge odds, they captured Antioch in June 1098 after a brutal siege and finally reached their ultimate goal in June 1099. They besieged Jerusalem for just over a month before breaking through the walls on July 15th. What followed remains one of the darkest moments in Crusader history. The victors massacred the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in a slaughter that shocked even the chroniclers of the time. One eyewitness, Raymond of Aguilers, described warriors wading in blood up to their ankles at the Temple Mount. Even if that was an exaggeration, it reflects the extreme violence of the conquest. With their objective secured, the victorious forces established the Kingdom of Jerusalem and several other states known collectively as Outremer, or the land beyond the sea. Godfrey of Bouillon became the first ruler, though he humbly refused the title of king, calling himself the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. When he died in 1100, his brother Baldwin I took the crown, starting a dynasty that would rule the city for nearly 90 years. But this remarkable victory created massive problems. Most crusaders went back to Europe once they had fulfilled their vows, leaving the new Christian state dangerously short on manpower. The Europeans were a tiny minority ruling over a mostly Muslim population. They controlled the big urban centers and strategic routes, but not the countryside. Their survival depended entirely on supplies and people coming from Europe, but the roads connecting the ports to the holy sites were terrifyingly unsafe. Hostile local forces controlled much of the land, and bandits specifically hunted down religious travelers on these vulnerable roads. Christian pilgrims who had survived the long, hard journey across the sea were often robbed or killed before they could even reach their destination. It was in this chaotic environment that a French knight named Hugues de Payens came up with a radical solution: a religious order dedicated specifically to the armed protection of pilgrims. In 1119, almost 20 years after the First Crusade's success, he and 8 fellow knights took solemn vows before King Baldwin II and the Patriarch. They established the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the seed that would grow into the legendary military order that transformed medieval society. In the early years of the 12th century, as pilgrims continued to face deadly risks, Hugues de Payens emerged as a man with a vision. A veteran knight from Champagne who had fought in the First Crusade, he recognized that the Kingdom of Jerusalem had a critical weakness: it simply could not protect the faithful travelers. Driven by a mix of deep faith and practical necessity, Hugh recruited 8 other knights who believed in his vision. History has preserved the names of these founding members, including Godfrey de Saint-Omer, Payen de Montdidier, Archambaud de Saint-Amand, André de Montbard, Geoffrey Bissal, and Gundamar. These men were the elite of European knighthood, highly trained in mounted warfare with years of combat experience under their belts. However, their new mission differed entirely from standard knightly quests because of its spiritual core. During a serious ceremony in front of King Baldwin II and Patriarch Warmund, these 9 men swore monastic vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. This created something the world had never seen before: a group combining total religious devotion with elite military skill. They dedicated themselves to a unique purpose: providing armed security for vulnerable pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads between the port of Jaffa and the holy sites inland. The timing could not have been better. King Baldwin II immediately saw the value in this dedicated security force. His young kingdom was surrounded by hostile territories, and his army was stretched too thin defending cities and forts. A mobile unit specifically focused on travel routes solved a major problem the royal army couldn't handle. In a historically vital move, Baldwin gave the new brotherhood a headquarters inside his own palace on the Temple Mount, right next to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This location was heavy with symbolism. It sat on the ruins of what Christians believed was Solomon's Temple, the spiritual center of Jerusalem. The knights took their name from this new home, calling themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. This base gave them a practical spot to launch patrols, but it also linked them to biblical history. Some historians believe they were inspired by the ancient Levites who guarded the original temple, a connection that added to their mystique. Despite having the king's approval, the group started with almost no resources. Records from the time state they were so poor that 2 knights had to share a single horse, an image that later became their famous seal. They wore donated clothes and relied on charity for food, living out their vows of poverty in a way that contrasted sharply with the flashy lifestyle of regular knights. Their daily work involved escorting groups of pilgrims through the most dangerous areas, specifically the bandit-filled hills leading from Jaffa. Using tactics learned during the Crusade, they organized travelers into guarded convoys, placing knights at the front and back to watch for ambushes. Witnesses credited them with immediately lowering the number of deaths among pilgrims. For about 9 years, they worked quietly and humbly, building a reputation for discipline and faith. However, they faced doubt from both religious and secular leaders. The idea of a warrior monk seemed like a contradiction. Monks were supposed to be peaceful and removed from the world, while knights sought glory and battle. By mixing these two opposites, the Templars challenged how society worked. Church leaders were especially worried, asking how a man could shed blood and still live a holy monastic life. This theological problem had to be solved before the order could grow. There were also confusing legal questions. As knights, did they answer to kings? Or as monks, did they answer to the church? This unique position caused headaches for both royal and church officials. Yet, despite the confusion, their success on the roads won them support. More knights joined, and pilgrims who survived thanks to their protection spread the word back home. Their simple look, initially just a plain white mantle representing purity, became famous in the Holy Land. News of this new order eventually reached Europe and caught the attention of Bernard of Clairvaux, the nephew of founding Knight André de Montbard. Bernard was the most powerful religious voice of his time, known for his intellect and holiness. Although he was skeptical at first, he soon realized the Templars could be a force for good. Hugh de Payens knew that to expand, he needed official approval from the highest levels of the Church. Around 1127, nearly 10 years after starting the order, Hugh traveled to Europe to get the Pope's blessing and find new recruits. This trip would turn the small group into something far bigger than they ever imagined. The timing was perfect because Europe was increasingly worried about the safety of the Crusader states following several military defeats. Hugh pitched his order as the solution: warriors who were both religious and deadly. Traveling through France, England, Scotland, and Flanders, Hugh gained the attention of high-ranking nobles. His most critical moment came at the Council of Troyes in January 1129, where church leaders gathered to decide the order's future. With Bernard of Clairvaux arguing their case, the church officially recognized the brotherhood. This was the turning point. Under Bernard's guidance, a formal rule was written for them, based on Cistercian monk traditions but adapted for soldiers. This document outlined their spiritual and military duties, creating a structure for growth. Bernard also wrote a famous defense titled In Praise of the New Knighthood, which explained why armed monks were theologically acceptable. The rule set up a clear chain of command with a Grand Master at the top, assisted by officers like the Seneschal and Marshal. It balanced prayer with combat training and set strict rules for behavior. Knights couldn't hunt for sport, gamble, or have any contact with women, even relatives. They had to keep their hair and beards a specific length, creating a serious, austere look that set them apart from regular knights. After this recognition, Pope Honorius II put the order directly under papal authority. This meant they didn't have to answer to local bishops or kings, only the Pope. This gave them massive freedom to operate across borders as an international organization. Later, Pope Eugenius III allowed them to add a red cross to their white mantles as a symbol of martyrdom. This red cross became their most iconic feature, inspiring respect and fear everywhere. With the church's backing, donations flooded in. Nobles gave land, castles, and money. Younger sons of nobility, often left without an inheritance, rushed to join. In just one decade, they went from 9 men sharing horses to a wealthy, international institution. When the Templars returned to the Holy Land, they were no longer just a local patrol unit. They were the first military religious order in history, a revolutionary force that would change warfare and finance forever. The Crusader states formed after the First Crusade were a political environment unlike anything in Europe. Collectively called Outremer, meaning the land beyond the sea, these Christian territories were carved out of Muslim-controlled lands and were a unique experiment in government. To understand the Templars' rise, you have to understand this complex map. The main power was the Kingdom of Jerusalem, running from the coast to the Jordan River. It was surrounded by the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Edessa. These states formed a thin strip of Christian rule, surrounded by powerful Muslim nations pressed in from nearly every direction. To govern these new Crusader states, the leaders attempted an awkward graft of European feudalism onto the landscape of the Middle East. Baldwin, the first man crowned king of Jerusalem, created a classic feudal ladder where European aristocrats received land grants in return for their pledge of military support. However, this imported system struggled against the realities of the region. Since there was a severe lack of European colonists, the day-to-day administration frequently depended on local officials, including both indigenous Christians and Muslims. While European borders were generally steady, the frontiers in Outremer were constantly shifting, with land swapping owners often through either military conquest or diplomatic treaties. To handle these unique conditions, the Kingdom of Jerusalem created specific political bodies like the High Court. This assembly of powerful feudal lords served to counsel the king while simultaneously keeping royal power in check. In contrast to the strict hereditary laws of Europe, the crown of Jerusalem was technically an elected position, although it usually stayed within one family line even when male heirs were scarce. Women were actually able to inherit the throne, a scenario that occurred much more frequently in Outremer than back in Europe. This dynamic led to complicated political situations where ruling queens or their husbands held sway, often triggering disputes over succession that enfeebled the state right when strength was needed most. The Templar Knights stepped into this tangled political network, acting as both involved players and autonomous agents. Over the years, their dynamic with the various kings of Jerusalem shifted significantly. In the beginning, under King Baldwin II, who gave them their temple Mount Base, the Brotherhood benefited from strong royal backing and protection as they set up their operations. Their main goal of keeping pilgrim roads safe fit perfectly with the crown's desire to ensure secure travel across the kingdom. As the order's riches and fighting strength increased, they slowly took on a wider role in defending the nation. By the middle of the century, they were building and manning key castles along exposed borders, transforming them from a backup security detail into a vital pillar of the military infrastructure. Monarchs began to depend on these Templar fortresses to project royal power into areas where the crown's direct grip was weak. Things got more complicated for the military orders during the rule of King Fulk, the former Count of Anjou who gained the throne by marrying Queen Melisande. Being new to local politics, Fulk needed trustworthy allies, and the Templars, boasting international fame and a direct link to the Pope, provided a great counterweight to established local nobles who often pushed back against the king. Yet tension was built into this relationship because the Templars didn't pay royal taxes and answered only to the Pope, effectively creating a semi-independent state within the kingdom itself. When the goals of the crown and the Templars matched, the kingdom was stronger, but when they disagreed, the resulting friction sabotaged any unified response to outside dangers. Beyond Jerusalem, the Brotherhood forged political ties in other Crusader territories, such as the County of Tripoli, where Count Raymond II gave them huge tracts of land, including vital mountain passes that guarded the routes to Antioch and the interior. They were more careful with the princes of Antioch, who were often caught up in Byzantine schemes, and their footprint in northern Edessa was small until that county fell to Muslim armies, a disaster that exposed just how fragile isolated Christian lands were. The political maze of Outremer wasn't just about internal Christian rule, it also involved complex dealings with nearby Muslim powers. Despite the common belief that religious war was non-stop, many eras were actually defined by diplomatic talks and negotiated coexistence. Economic survival depended on trade routes, fostering a mutual reliance that often crossed religious lines. Diplomats frequently used treaties to set up temporary truces or borders, and the Templars, known for sticking rigidly to their word, sometimes acted as go-betweens in these talks. As their clout grew, the Brotherhood got sucked into the factional infighting that tormented the Crusader states. Aristocratic clans constantly vied for status and control, building alliances based on fleeting self-interest rather than solid principles. Crusaders fresh from Europe often butted heads with second-generation settlers born in the East, whom they mocked as poulains. These native-born Franks had a different view on living alongside Muslim neighbors, often pushing for compromise, a stance the newcomers saw as a betrayal of Christian goals. In this divided environment, the Templars usually sided with the hardliners, favoring military force to ensure the safety of their lands. This outlook came from their hands-on experience guarding defenseless travelers from raiders who would attack at the first sign of weakness. Consequently, they often clashed with rulers who wanted to use diplomacy to make up for a lack of soldiers. Adding to the mess were the relations between the military orders themselves. The Hospitallers, originally founded as a medical charity for pilgrims, had developed a military wing partly to match Templar success, even though they served different needs. An intense rivalry grew between the two groups over donations, recruits, and clout, sometimes escalating into actual violence that forced the Pope or the King to step in and force them to cooperate. The political terrain changed instantly after the catastrophic Battle of Hattin and the loss of Jerusalem to Saladin's army. With the capital gone and the kingdom shrunk to just a handful of coastal ports, political authority crumbled in the panic. Because they had their own money and global recruitment pipelines, the military orders gained massive influence compared to the now weakened secular kings. Through all these shifts, the Templars struggled with the core challenge of balancing their spiritual duties with the gritty reality of politics. While their vows bound them to defend Christian lands, doing so effectively required political schemes that sometimes went against their monastic values. Different Grand Masters handled this stress in different ways. Some stayed strictly independent, while others got deeply involved in governing the region. By the late 1100s, the order was absolutely essential for the Crusader states to survive politically. Their fortresses provided the main line of defense, their wealth propped up empty royal treasuries, and their connections helped secure foreign alliances. However, being so necessary caused secular leaders to resent them, as they felt their own authority was being choked by Templar power. The complex politics of Outremer molded the Templar order just as much as the order influenced the region. Starting as simple road guards, they had turned into sophisticated political operators, juggling roles as military protectors, financial heavyweights, and the Pope's representatives in the East. This evolution paved the way for their future international fame, but it also planted the seeds of tension that would eventually lead to their destruction. Transforming a tiny group of protective knights into a global powerhouse required more than a nod from the Pope. It needed a total structural framework to dictate every part of a member's life, ranging from when they prayed to how they fought. That framework arrived as the Templar Rule, an incredible text that fused the discipline of a monk with the needs of a soldier. Creating this rule at the Council of Troyes was a turning point for the order. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, the era's most powerful religious voice, was key in writing it. His work, In Praise of the New Knighthood, supplied the theological bedrock needed for such a radical idea. In this text, Bernard separated Templars from regular knights, whom he bashed for their vanity, showiness, and desire for personal fame. In contrast, the Templars stood for a new ideal, men fighting to protect the innocent and defend Christendom rather than seeking worldly applause. Bernard wrote that a knight who guards his soul with the armor of faith while cladding his body in steel is truly safe and without fear. Because he is shielded physically by steel and spiritually by faith, he has no reason to fear men or demons. Such a strong approval from a respected figure quieted the critics who doubted that a life of war could mix with a life of prayer. The initial Latin rule contained 72 articles that built the order's spiritual and organizational base. In the following decades, the text grew considerably, adding sections to handle specific scenarios and bring more nuance to the regulations. It covered everything from mandatory daily prayers to the correct way to ride a horse, serving as a complete manual for living as a Templar. At the very top of the hierarchy was the Grand Master, a leader elected for life by a gathering of the senior brethren. This role demanded both religious devotion and tactical brilliance, as it merged spiritual leadership with military command. The Grand Master led the chapter, the central governing council where senior members collaborated to make major decisions for the whole order. Beneath the Grand Master, several officers handled specific duties. The seneschal acted as the administrator and second-in-command, while the marshal took charge of training, equipment, and war operations. Meanwhile, the commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem ran things in the order's spiritual center. The draper managed the supply of clothes and gear, and the treasurer oversaw the finances, a job that became more complicated as time went on. With the order's riches piling up, the system expanded. They established regional divisions known as commanderies, each with its own chain of command that ultimately answered to the Grand Master. This complex administrative web allowed them to manage operations across massive distances effectively, especially in an era where news only traveled as fast as a horse could gallop. Although the Grand Master held the final say, the reality of the times demanded that regional commanders have plenty of independence, as waiting for orders from headquarters could take months. Beyond just the organizational chart, the rule carved out a strict class system within the Brotherhood. Full Knight brothers formed the elite fighting corps and came solely from noble families. Sergeant brothers, who hailed from common backgrounds, handled support roles in combat and managed administrative tasks. Chaplain brothers were ordained priests who looked after the members' spiritual welfare, while serving brothers took care of the nitty-gritty work, from blacksmithing to cooking. This hierarchy mirrored the social layers of the Middle Ages, but created a functional machine where every man knew his exact job. Daily existence under the rule adhered to a clockwork schedule, balancing holy devotion with soldiering. Brothers woke up before dawn to pray, attended several religious services throughout the day, and observed strict periods of silence between these duties. In the gaps, knights drilled in combat skills, tended to their mounts and gear, and finished their assigned chores. This grinding routine forged the iron discipline that made Templar knights stand out on the battlefield. St. Bernard's influence meant the religious side of things leaned heavily on Cistercian traditions. Mandatory attendance at canonical hours, regular prayer times day and night, kept the monastic vibe alive even when they were on a war campaign. If military duty separated them from their chapel, brothers had to make up for it by reciting the Lord's Prayer. The Templar spiritual life rested on three main pillars: poverty, chastity, and obedience. While the order as an institution could hoard massive wealth for its mission, the individual members renounced all personal belongings. A knight owned neither cash nor land, receiving uniform clothes and weapons from the communal supply. Even accepting a gift without permission from a superior was considered a major crime. The vow of chastity went further than just sexual abstinence. It demanded total moral purity. Knights were banned from kissing any woman, even their own mothers or sisters. They couldn't be alone with females, share a wash basin with them, or even let a woman nurse them if they fell sick. These rigid bans were designed to crush temptation and keep the Brotherhood laser-focused on the spirit. For a military order, obedience was perhaps the most critical vow of all. In the heat of battle, hesitation or doing your own thing could get the whole unit killed. The rule demanded instant compliance with orders, creating the tight discipline that made Templar units so deadly in a fight. This total surrender of self-will applied to every part of life. Diet, clothing, and grooming were all strictly regulated. Meals were mostly vegetable-based, with meat allowed only 3 times a week, and everyone ate in silence while listening to Bible readings. To keep the mindset of a monk even while prepping for war, full knights wore the famous white mantle, while sergeant brothers wore brown or black, all emblazoned with the Red Cross once the Pope gave the okay. Grooming rules were a mix of practical and symbolic. Hair was cut short so it wouldn't block their vision in a fight, but they grew neat beards to distinguish themselves from the fashionable, clean-shaven secular knights. These rules created a visually unique force that was instantly recognizable on the field. Keeping order relied on a sliding scale of punishments. Small slip-ups might mean losing a meal or saying extra prayers. Medium offenses could lead to a flogging or being isolated from the group. The worst crimes, especially those that hurt the order's reputation, resulted in expulsion, which effectively destroyed a knight's career and identity. The rule also micromanaged battlefield behavior, balancing strategy with ethics. Knights were strictly told never to retreat unless the enemy outnumbered them 3-1. This rule built their terrifying reputation for holding the line. Discipline in formation was everything. No brother could charge out alone, even if victory looked easy without a direct order. Surprisingly for the time, the rule included instructions to treat prisoners humanely and respect truces with Muslim forces, even while defending Christian lands. The order understood the practical need to coexist on the frontier. This pragmatic attitude sometimes caused friction with other Crusade leaders who wanted a more hardline stance against their neighbors. As the order spread out, the rule adapted to different environments. In Europe, away from the war zones, the focus was on making money and recruiting men. In the East, the focus was on combat readiness and defense. This flexibility let the order keep its core identity while fitting in wherever they went. The comprehensive nature of the Templar rule made it a game-changer in medieval history. By blending two seemingly opposite jobs, monk and warrior, it created a brand new model that other groups would copy. The Hospitallers added a military wing with similar rules, and the Teutonic Knights borrowed heavily from Templar organization. On a deeper level, the rule reflected a shift in religious thinking. It valued active purpose over quiet withdrawal, aligning with a movement toward a practical Christianity that engaged with the real world. The Templar Knight, fighting for a holy cause rather than personal fame, embodied the idea of sanctified violence, reconciling the teachings of Christ with the brutal reality of the Middle Ages. For nearly 200 years, this document guided one of the most unique organizations in history. By balancing spiritual strictness with military efficiency, it laid the groundwork for the Templars to rise to unmatched power across Europe and the Near East. By regulating every breath a member took, the rule turned individual knights into cogs in a massive machine that would reshape history. After getting official recognition at the Council of Troyes, the Templar Order exploded in size, transforming from a small protection squad into one of medieval Europe's heavyweights. This rapid climb was driven by a few key things: smart land grabs, military tech, royal friends, and an organization that ignored borders. Noble families tripped over themselves to support the order with donations. Whether they were truly pious or just trying to buy spiritual insurance for their sins, lords all over the continent gave huge chunks of property to the Brotherhood. A typical record from back then might say, "I, Count Raymond, give to God and the Knights of the Temple the castle of Barbara and all its lands to save my soul and my parents' souls." Thousands of these gifts piled up, creating a massive network of Templar real estate stretching from Scotland to the Mediterranean. These assets took many forms to fit the local economy. Farms brought in rent and food. City buildings and commercial hubs generated cash. Strategically placed castles locked down trade routes and projected military power. Every donation, big or small, added to the economic engine funding their mission in the Holy Land. Managing this booming portfolio took a complex system. Local commanders, overseen by a preceptor, ran their regions like semi-independent businesses, maximizing profit. A cut of all revenue was sent east to fund the front line, creating a constant pipeline of European cash flowing to the war zone. This gave Templar forces a huge financial leg up over other Crusaders who relied on sporadic checks from back home. While expanding across the map, the Order set up their iconic headquarters in Paris, the Temple. Located near the modern Place de la République, this fortified complex was the nerve center for the West. Its giant stone tower held the treasury, archives, and the central bank. Kings and nobles stashed their valuables in its vaults, trusting the heavy security. The Paris Temple became so vital to France that it often hosted royal councils and acted as the treasury for the French monarchy. In England, their London HQ, the New Temple, did the same thing. King John kept the crown jewels there, and Henry III used Templar accountants to manage royal funds across Europe. Templar preceptors became key players in local politics and economics, turning the order from foreign guests into essential infrastructure. But their value wasn't just about money. Their castles sat on critical defense points throughout Christian lands, creating a web of forts that backed up royal defenses in the Holy Land. Strongholds like Chateau Pellerin stood as massive symbols of Christian power, controlling key roads and providing safe bases for attacks. Under Templar direction, castle architecture used cutting-edge engineering, often borrowing tricks from the Byzantines and Muslims. They used concentric rings of walls, carefully planned, killing zones, and narrow firing slits. They pioneered features like bent entrances to stop battering rams from gaining speed, and murder holes to attack enemies who managed to breach the gate. Construction styles changed depending on where they were. In the desert, water storage was the main priority, leading to massive cisterns. Mountain castles used the jagged terrain as part of the defense. Coastal forts were built to handle naval supplies, but this practical mindset regarding military structures, prioritizing utility over showing off, was a perfect example of how the Templars operated in every area. The Brotherhood's effectiveness in war came from more than just their strong walls. It was built on groundbreaking battlefield tactics. Rigorous drills produced disciplined squads that could execute complicated maneuvers that standard feudal armies simply couldn't pull off. The Templars introduced standardized signals and commands, enabling them to react instantly to shifting chaos during a fight. The order enforced rigid discipline within their formations, strictly forbidding knights from breaking the line to chase personal glory. This distinctive style of combat addressed a common flaw found in other Crusader armies and showed a practical understanding of Middle Eastern warfare. While heavy European cavalry tactics were powerful, they had to be modified to counter the lighter, faster enemies they faced in the Holy Land. Templar squads created hybrid strategies, blending the shock power of the West with the mobile warfare styles of the East. They kept specialized scouting teams who knew the local landscape intimately and were trained to spot even the faintest signs of enemy troop movements. Unlike many arrogant European generals who disregarded Muslim tactics as dishonorable, Templar commanders analyzed and adopted successful enemy methods whenever it gave them an edge. Breeding horses was another field where the Templars excelled. The order managed massive stud farms focused on raising war horses with the specific traits required for armored fighting in the desert. These animals needed more than just massive size and raw power. They also required the stamina to endure intense heat. By crossbreeding heavy European destroyers with agile Arabian bloodlines, the Templars engineered mounts that were perfectly suited to their harsh environment. Their skill in this area became so famous that nobles back in Europe frequently asked the Templars for advice on their own breeding programs. The Second Crusade provided the first real chance for the Templars to show off their growing power. When the massive armies of Europe marched east under Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, Templar units offered crucial support. Their grasp of local terrain, superior supply lines, and disciplined troops stood in sharp contrast to the chaotic nature of the main Crusader forces. When that crusade ultimately failed, most people blamed the bad planning and leadership of the kings rather than the Templars, which actually boosted the order's reputation instead of hurting it. Over the following decades, the Brotherhood kept expanding their military role in protecting the Crusader states. By the middle of the 12th century, they had evolved from simple escort guards into a vital part of the frontline defense. Their performance at the Battle of Montchassard, where a vastly outnumbered Crusader army crushed Saladin's forces, solidified their legend as elite warriors. Writers of the time gave credit to Templar discipline for holding the lines together during key moments of that unlikely victory. This evolution of their military might was largely shaped by capable grandmasters, especially André de Montbard, the fifth man to lead the order. As the uncle of Bernard of Clairvaux and one of the original founding knights, André mixed spiritual command with real-world combat experience. Under his watch, the Brotherhood perfected their unique blend of monk-like obedience and lethal efficiency. His personal ties to high-ranking European nobles helped bring in donations that massively grew their resources. Under his direction, the order created standardized training programs that turned recruits from all over into a single, unified fighting machine. Unlike the random, inconsistent training found in feudal armies, Templar knights went through a systematic education focused on the exact skills needed for their mission. Training in weapons, riding, and formation movement was given just as much weight as religious study, producing soldiers whose discipline in battle was rooted in their faith. While the Templars' fighting skills got all the attention from history books, their improvements to logistics were just as revolutionary. The order built complex supply networks, keeping safe paths open between their ports on the Mediterranean and their forts inland. They built special warehouses designed to keep food from spoiling in the desert heat, and set up relay stations to ensure messengers always had fresh horses for urgent deliveries. These unglamorous but vital systems allowed them to keep fighting in environments that usually destroyed other Crusader armies through starvation and exhaustion. Their engineering teams became famous for quickly building bridges, designing siege weapons, and managing water supplies in dry areas. When Crusader forces needed special gear for specific campaigns, Templar workshops often supplied both the know-how and the raw materials. Their practical nature meant they cared more about what worked than what was traditional. They willingly used techniques from Byzantine and Muslim engineers if those methods were better than European ones. By the late 1100s, the order had reached a level of status in European society that was previously unheard of. Kings asked for their war advice, nobles copied their organization, and common people looked at them with a mix of wonder and mystery. Their famous white mantles with the Red Cross had become the universal symbol of Christian military strength from Scotland all the way to Syria. The humble group started to protect pilgrims had turned into a global institution with influence at the very top of medieval society. However, this incredibly fast rise came with built-in contradictions that would eventually help cause their destruction. The massive amount of money needed to run their army created awkward tension with their vow of poverty. Because they were exempt from local church laws and answered only to the Pope, they often clashed with local bishops. Their international setup, which ignored borders, sometimes put them in conflict with rising nations that wanted total control over their own lands. However, during their rise to power, these issues were managed through careful diplomacy and the undeniable value of their work. The order's pragmatic leaders usually had enough political savvy to handle their complicated relationships with different backers. Their strict rules minimized scandals that could hurt their image, while their constant fighting to defend Christendom justified their special rights in the eyes of most people. This golden era of Templar power would eventually face its hardest test during the disastrous events around the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin. Yet, even that catastrophe, which changed the Crusades forever, initially made the order even more important, as regular armies proved unable to hold the Holy Land. The disciplined, rich military orders became the only reliable wall against Muslim reconquest, setting the scene for the next part of their amazing story. Masters of the Mediterranean, Templar naval power. While the picture of armored knights charging on horseback is what most people think of when they hear Templar, their command of medieval warfare went far beyond land battles. By the middle of the 12th century, the Brotherhood had built a massive naval force that completely changed the power dynamics of the eastern Mediterranean. This move into naval warfare was a strategic innovation just as important as their armies on the ground. The geography of the Crusader states made mastering the sea a necessity. Christian lands in the Levant relied entirely on ships from Europe for backup troops, supplies, and news. If those sea routes were cut off, the survival of the Crusader states was at risk. Muslim navies knew this was a weak point and often attacked Christian ships, while pirates hid in countless coves along the coast, hunting down merchant boats and pilgrims. Seeing these dangers, the Templar leadership made a calculated choice to build their own naval power. This expansion into the sea started small, buying just a few merchant ships to move supplies from Europe to their command centers in the east. At first, these ships were just for logistics, moving horses, weapons, and new recruits to help the land war. However, the Brotherhood soon realized that to have effective logistics, they needed to protect the sea lanes, which led them to build dedicated war galleys. The Templars set up their main naval headquarters at the port of Acre, building special facilities to fix and run their ships. They built stone docks, shipyards, and warehouses, creating a complex that visitors said was as good as anything in the major ports of Europe. They added more naval bases at Tyre, Jaffa, and smaller harbors, creating a chain of safe zones for Templar ships patrolling the coast. Their fleet included several different types of ships, each with a specific job in their naval strategy. They used galleys with shallow bottoms for patrolling the coast and chasing down pirates. They also used massive transport ships called naves to carry heavy loads, including the warhorses that were so vital to Templar battles. They even had special pilgrim ships with reinforced decks to carry hundreds of travelers who were journeying to fulfill religious vows. At the peak of their naval strength, records suggest the Brotherhood had dozens of ships sailing all over the Mediterranean. Running this fleet required special skills that traditional knights didn't have. To fix this, the Order created a specific marine division within their ranks. Templar sailors became experts at navigation, steering ships, and fighting at sea. Command roles usually went to knights who showed a talent for naval operations, while skilled sailors from the Italian maritime republics often joined as technical experts, bringing advanced sailing knowledge to the Brotherhood. Templar naval missions served many strategic goals beyond just moving cargo. Regular patrols along pilgrim routes massively cut down on pirate attacks against defenseless traveler ships. They created convoy systems that grouped merchant ships under Templar guard, which improved security for commerce and strengthened the economy between East and West. Their navy provided essential backup for castles along the coast, bringing in supplies and reinforcements to forts that otherwise would have fallen to sieges. The value of Templar sea power was especially clear during the Third Crusade when Christian armies laid siege to Acre. Templar ships held a crucial blockade, stopping Muslim relief boats from reaching the city. They moved siege weapons that were too heavy to carry over land and evacuated wounded soldiers to safe areas in the rear. This multi-layered support was key to the Christians eventually retaking that vital port city. Beyond war, Templar ships provided crucial travel services for the whole crusading movement. When European nobles and their entourages traveled east, they often booked tickets on Templar ships because they knew they were safe and ran on a reliable schedule. Pilgrims with less money also tried to get on Templar transport when they could, willing to pay higher prices for the security those ships offered. The Brotherhood created standard ticket prices and set regular departure times between big Mediterranean ports, basically inventing an early version of a passenger cruise line. The sailing skills they learned for war also brought in a lot of money. In times of peace, Templar ships worked as traders, moving valuable Eastern luxury goods to European markets and bringing Western products back east. The profits from these shipping runs helped pay for the Order's massive military budget while tightening economic bonds between distant lands. Because they were known for being honest and delivering on time, Templar ships were the top choice for moving expensive cargo that needed high security. The Brotherhood showed amazing creativity in their naval operations. Their ships mixed designs from both Western and Eastern shipbuilding traditions, resulting in hybrid vessels that were perfectly adapted to the Mediterranean. The Western-style deep hulls gave them stability and plenty of room for cargo. On the other hand, they incorporated Eastern-style lateen sails to ensure superior maneuverability amidst the shifting winds that characterize the Levant. This practical mindset defined the Templar approach to ship design, as they rigidly adopted effective techniques regardless of where they came from, and this blending of traditions extended to their navigational habits as well. For example, the Order's mariners combined Western reliance on coastal landmarks and simple charts with astronomical navigation skills mastered by Muslim sailors for night travel. To keep their fleet organized, they utilized signal lanterns arranged in specific patterns, a system far more advanced than what other European navies were using at the time. Even with a relatively small number of ships, these technical edges gave Templar vessels operational advantages that maximized their effectiveness. Naturally, this naval power significantly boosted their political standing within the Crusader states. Since they controlled critical shipping lanes, they held major leverage in negotiations with secular leaders who were constantly worried about maintaining communications with Europe. In fact, when political disputes broke out between European powers operating in the East, the Templars' naval neutrality often made them the only trustworthy option for ferrying diplomats to peace conferences. This mastery of the sea rounded out their military strength on land, creating a total security package that no secular authority could match. Their nautical expertise proved especially valuable during times when the war went poorly on land, and inland territories were lost to Muslim armies. The military orders held onto coastal fortresses as the primary Christian footholds in the region, and the ability to supply these positions by boat ensured their survival even when they were surrounded by hostile territory. After the disaster at the Battle of Hattin and the subsequent loss of Jerusalem, Templar naval capabilities played a vital role in holding together the surviving coastal fragments of the Crusader states. Of course, maritime operations presented unique challenges for an order bound by monastic vows. Life aboard a medieval ship involved hardships and dangers that land-based commanders never faced. Long voyages meant they had to adapt their strict prayer schedules and dietary rules. Consequently, the Brotherhood developed specific regulations for their seafaring members to balance spiritual duties with the practical necessities of life at sea. Ship chaplains conducted religious services tailored to the conditions on board, maintaining the order's spiritual character even in this specialized branch. The Templar fleet hit its peak influence in the decades following the Third Crusade, once Jerusalem was lost and Christian territory was reduced to the coast. With survival on the line, naval power became proportionally more important. The Brotherhood's ships kept essential connections open between isolated Christian outposts that would have been impossible to defend otherwise. Just having these maritime patrols in the water acted as a significant deterrent to Muslim naval forces considering attacks on vulnerable coastal towns. Archaeological evidence from Templar port facilities reveals the sophisticated infrastructure that supported these naval operations. Excavations at Achaia have uncovered dedicated warehouses for marine equipment, workshops for sail production, and slipways designed for efficient vessel maintenance. These physical ruins confirm old written accounts describing highly organized maritime activities running on standardized procedures. The massive investment in these facilities proves just how strategically important the Order considered their naval capabilities. Though they are less celebrated than the Mounted Knights, Templar sailors made equally crucial contributions to the Order's mission and reputation. Their mastery of Mediterranean seafaring extended the Brotherhood's protective reach beyond land routes to cover the sea lanes connecting Europe with the Holy Land. This comprehensive security strategy, covering both land and sea, established the Templars as the indispensable guardians of Christian interests in the East. Interestingly, the maritime legacy of the Templar Order outlasted their presence in the Levant. When Christian territories in the Holy Land finally fell, elements of their naval expertise were transferred to other maritime powers, particularly in Portugal, where many Templar resources were absorbed by the successor Order of Christ. This Portuguese connection would later influence the age of exploration, as ships bearing the distinctive cross of Christ, evolved from the Templar emblem, ventured into the Atlantic under commanders trained in navigational techniques descended from Templar practices. By developing effective naval capabilities alongside their famous land forces, the Brotherhood demonstrated an integrated approach to medieval security operations that was centuries ahead of its time. This comprehensive strategy, encompassing both domains, created the operational foundation for their rise to unprecedented power and influence throughout the Mediterranean world. While the martial skills of the Templar Order drew the most attention from people at the time, their most revolutionary innovation may have been financial rather than military. They started out with humble beginnings protecting the physical safety of pilgrims, but the religious warriors soon evolved into guardians of their economic security as well, developing financial instruments and banking practices that transformed the medieval economy and established precedents still visible in modern finance. This transformation began with a practical problem. Medieval pilgrims traveling to sacred sites faced significant dangers beyond just physical attacks. Chief among them was the risk of carrying the substantial wealth necessary for such a long journey. Hauling gold coins and valuables made travelers obvious targets for bandits, even if they successfully defended themselves from robbery. Furthermore, managing currency across regions that used different monetary systems posed huge challenges for medieval travelers. Recognizing these difficulties, the knight monks developed an elegant solution that would revolutionize medieval finance. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a commandery in their home country and receive a document encoded with symbols that only officials of the order could understand. Upon reaching their destination, the traveler would present this document to the local establishment and receive equivalent funds in local currency, minus a modest service fee. This system, a forerunner to modern letters of credit, dramatically reduced the risks of long-distance travel while generating operational income for the military order. The practical advantages of this arrangement were immediately apparent to merchants and nobles, as well as religious pilgrims. As commercial activity expanded in the High Middle Ages, traders eagerly embraced this secure method for transferring funds between distant markets without physically transporting valuables. The network of these warrior bankers, stretching from Scotland to Cyprus, enabled commerce on a scale previously unimaginable, helping to fuel the commercial revolution that transformed European economic life. Royal houses quickly recognized the utility of such services for governmental operations. Medieval kingdoms typically lacked permanent financial institutions capable of managing state resources. Royal treasuries often consisted of little more than strongboxes that followed the monarch from castle to castle, creating significant security and administrative headaches. The International Brotherhood offered an attractive alternative: secure facilities managed by literate administrators with standardized accounting practices and international reach. King Louis VII of France became an early adopter of these services following his participation in the Second Crusade, where he witnessed the financial competence of these monastic knights firsthand. Upon returning to France, he appointed one of their members as royal treasurer and began storing crown funds in their Paris headquarters. This arrangement established a pattern other monarchs would follow, particularly in England, where King John and later Henry III developed deep financial relationships with the military order. By the early 13th century, the Paris Temple effectively functioned as the French national treasury, with dedicated officials managing royal accounts separately from the organization's own finances. The administrative infrastructure supporting these financial operations demonstrated impressive sophistication for its era. The holy warriors maintained standardized accounting practices across their international network, using double-entry bookkeeping methods that were not widely adopted in Europe until centuries later. Regular financial inspections by visiting officials from headquarters ensured adherence to these standards, creating unprecedented accountability. The records clearly distinguished between organizational funds and client deposits, a concept of segregated accounts protecting customer assets that would later become fundamental to modern banking regulation. The financial expertise of these crusading bankers extended beyond simple deposit services to include functions recognizable as lending activities. While medieval church prohibitions against usury, charging interest, technically restricted lending practices, the order developed various arrangements that effectively provided credit while remaining within religious guidelines. Mortgage arrangements involving property transfers, exchange rate adjustments, and strategic fees all enabled capital deployment, while avoiding the direct interest charges forbidden to Christians. These credit facilities proved particularly valuable to European monarchs, who were perpetually short of funds for military campaigns and governmental operations. When King Louis IX prepared for his crusade, substantial loans from the military brotherhood financed his expedition. Henry III of England repeatedly turned to their credit to address royal financial shortfalls. These high-profile lending relationships with ruling houses enhanced the order's political influence while generating income for their core missions. The physical infrastructure supporting these financial operations impressed contemporary observers. Major houses of the knightly order contained specialized treasury chambers with sophisticated security features. The Paris Temple featured a multi-story stone tower with walls several feet thick, accessible only through a single fortified entrance guarded day and night by the warrior monks. Within these secured spaces, iron-bound chests organized by region contained precisely documented valuables and financial records. These physical facilities represented the most secure storage available in medieval Europe, attracting deposits from those seeking unmatched protection for their wealth. Beyond physical security, this financial network offered additional advantages. The literate membership maintained meticulous records in an age when literacy remained uncommon. Their international structure facilitated transfers between regions using different currencies and financial systems. Furthermore, their religious status provided moral assurance of honest dealing that was absent from secular financial operators. These combined benefits made their services attractive even to Jewish and Muslim merchants who might otherwise be suspicious of Christian institutions. The scale of their financial operations grew to remarkable proportions. When French officials later seized the Paris headquarters, they required weeks just to inventory its contents, discovering substantial deposits from nobles, merchants, religious institutions, and foreign dignitaries alongside royal treasures. Archaeological excavations of sites used by the order have unearthed specialized scales for precise coin weighing, seal matrices for document authentication, and accounting tokens used for complex calculations, all physical evidence of sophisticated financial operations. The banking functions of these warrior monks extended to estate management services that would today be considered trust and investment activities. Crusading nobles departing for extended periods often placed their entire estates under the administration of this trusted order. The Knight brothers would manage agricultural properties, collect rents, resolve tenant disputes, and deliver revenues either to the owner's destination in the East or to designated family members remaining in Europe. This required serious administrative skill, including navigating property rights across different legal territories. However, these financial operations weren't without their critics. Traditional religious figures often questioned whether a monastic order dedicated to spiritual warfare should really be so deeply tangled in worldly finance. Meanwhile, secular moneylenders hated the competition because the Templars were exempt from taxes and many commercial regulations. Jewish financiers, who had previously dominated the credit markets, saw their roles shrinking as Christian rulers started preferring the services of these Christian bankers. The order defended itself by claiming that protecting a pilgrim's money was just another way of protecting their physical safety, much like their swords guarded bodies. They argued that the revenues generated by these services directly funded the defense of Christian lands in the East. This practical excuse worked for most people at the time, even if the clash between spiritual ideals and business created some internal arguments among the brothers. The complexity of their banking raises cool historical questions about where they learned it all. Some experts think they borrowed ideas from Islamic financial systems they encountered in the East, as Muslim merchants used credit tools that avoided interest-bearing loans. Byzantine methods for documenting commercial deals might have also played a part. Basically, the Brotherhood was pragmatic enough to adopt any effective method they found, regardless of where it came from. Before these warrior monks stepped in, merchants doing long-distance trade had a nightmare dealing with currency exchange and carrying cash safely. The Templar network smashed these barriers, making trade possible across huge distances. This helped spark the massive commercial revival that transformed the European economy during the High Middle Ages. By the late 13th century, their system hit its peak, operating as a massive international banking web stretching from England to Cyprus and from Scandinavia to Sicily. Their commanders offered standardized financial services to everyone, whether you were a peasant pilgrim or a king. This infrastructure was an institutional feat unmatched until the Italian banks rose centuries later. Sadly, the fate of this financial empire was tied to the order's collapse. Their role as lenders to the French crown, specifically the massive debt owed by King Philip IV, became a huge reason for their eventual destruction. When armed knights raided the Paris Temple in October 1307, it wasn't just an arrest. It was the hostile takeover of a national bank. Yet their financial innovations lived on long after the order died. Successor institutions, especially Italian banking houses, picked up right where the Templars left off. Ideas like documentary credit, international transfers, and secure deposits became standard parts of the European economy. Their practical solutions to medieval problems set precedents we still see in modern banking. Watching warrior monks evolve into international bankers is one of history's most fascinating shifts. By moving from guarding bodies to guarding wealth, they built a legacy far bigger than just their battles. Those who mastered the sword proved just as skilled at wielding the financial tools that reshaped the medieval economy. But banking was just one slice of the pie. The financial innovations described earlier were only part of the warrior monk's broader impact. The Brotherhood built a total economic system that included farming, manufacturing, shipping, and even early forms of nation-building. This self-sustaining engine powered their military and political moves across 2 continents. The bedrock of this empire was vast farmland donated by supporters throughout Europe. Unlike other orders that worked the fields themselves, the Templars used a manorial tenant system where local farmers leased the land. This smart move kept their own personnel numbers low while guaranteeing steady income through rents, crops, and service fees. They were also masters of efficiency, pioneering crop rotation to save the soil. They built irrigation channels in the Mediterranean and drainage systems in the north, while carefully managing forests for sustainable timber. Their systematic approach meant their agricultural yields were simply better than the medieval average. They were experts with livestock, too. Their massive sheep flocks produced wool for international markets, and their horse breeding programs supplied top-tier chargers for both war and noble buyers. In Iberia, their cattle ranching techniques even laid the groundwork for methods later used in the Americas. They didn't just grow things, they processed them. They ran water-powered mills to grind grain, press oil, and finish cloth. They operated wineries to turn their grapes into exportable wine and ran specialized workshops for leather, iron, and textiles. This added massive value to their raw goods and kept them independent from outside suppliers. The scale of this operation required next-level administration. They used standardized accounting and regular inventories to track every asset. Annual reports flowed from local commanderies all the way to headquarters, giving them a clear view of their entire international network, something unheard of at the time. This let them make informed decisions about where to send resources. They also understood regional strengths. They encouraged production based on local conditions: wool from England, olive oil from the Mediterranean, grain from Central Europe, and timber from the mountains. They moved these goods through their own internal network, anticipating economic principles that wouldn't be formally written down for centuries. Their reach wasn't limited to the countryside. They owned huge chunks of major cities too. Their commanderies in big cities controlled surrounding districts with workshops and homes that generated rent. The New Temple in London included shops along Fleet Street, and the Paris Temple controlled valuable urban real estate, giving them income and political leverage. Then there was transportation. Beyond their naval fleet, they had an overland network with standardized way stations for secure rest. Their convoys carried their own goods and freight for paying customers, acting as an early common carrier service. Because they were armed monks, their security was top-notch for high-value cargo. By combining farming, processing, transport, and banking, they achieved incredible efficiency. Grain from a Templar farm could be ground at a Templar mill, moved on a Templar wagon to a Templar ship, and sold via a Templar bank transaction. This vertical integration cut costs and maximized profit at every step. To run this machine, they employed a vast workforce beyond the brothers themselves, including tenants, laborers, and clerks. Interestingly, they were good bosses. They paid better than average wages to attract talent and enforced safety rules that were rare for the era. Their practices showed a concern for worker welfare that blended religious values with business sense. They also specialized in developing frontier lands in places like Iberia and Eastern Europe. They would take grants of wild territory and transform them by clearing forests, building mills, and setting up defenses. This made them incredibly useful to rulers trying to tame new lands. Finally, the connection between Europe and the East was strictly managed. European estates acted as a support base, sending a set percentage of revenue to the Holy Land. This gave the Templars a reliable financial pipeline that other Crusaders, who relied on sporadic funding, simply didn't have. Unlike the regular Crusaders, who were often left waiting on inconsistent donations from wealthy backers back home, the Templars built a financial engine that could weather almost any storm. Even when political chaos or military defeats in the East brought normal trade to a halt, the Order's economic operations remained remarkably resilient. If one route was blocked, they simply shifted their resources through different channels within their vast network. This flexibility was a lifesaver after the loss of Jerusalem, allowing their financial infrastructure to keep humming along even as their territorial map was being redrawn. Because their system was decentralized, a disaster in one location didn't cripple the entire organization, a distinct advantage over more centralized medieval institutions. Naturally, the sheer economic power generated by these interconnected systems caught the eye of the political elite. Kings and princes saw the strategic value in an organization that could instantly move massive amounts of supplies and wealth across borders. The French monarchy, in particular, became heavily reliant on the warrior bankers, utilizing the Templar administrative machine to collect taxes and manage the crown's accounts. The knights even provided secure storage for royal valuables. However, becoming the personal accountants for the state created a dangerous entanglement with secular politics that would eventually pave the way for their destruction. Looking at the records, it is clear these men possessed a level of financial literacy that was incredibly rare for their time. The administrators of the order understood complex concepts like exchange rates, currency depreciation, and how to preserve capital. Because they operated internationally, they knew exactly which currencies were stable and which were risky. They used this practical knowledge not only to manage their own treasury, but to advise clients on how to protect their wealth when kings decided to manipulate currency values. Archaeological digs at former Templar sites have backed up these written records with hard physical evidence. Excavations of their warehouses show they used standardized systems for tracking inventory. Ruins of their workshops reveal layouts designed for assembly line efficiency, while their farms utilized advanced water management technology to boost crop yields. These findings confirm that their reputation for systematic organization wasn't just talk. It was built into the very foundations of their properties. The ripple effects of their business activities spread far beyond their own walls. Entire regional markets sprang up around Templar commanderies, and roads were improved to handle their heavy trade traffic. The banking techniques they invented in their private counting houses eventually filtered out to the rest of society, influencing how secular merchants did business. In this way, their innovations jump-started economic development across medieval Europe. Interestingly, the Templars didn't set out to be economic philosophers. They were purely pragmatic. The administrators didn't care about abstract theories. If they encountered a problem where the old ways didn't work, they simply invented a new solution based on what they observed on the ground. This practical mindset allowed them to implement fixes rapidly without getting bogged down in theological debates. While history books usually focus on their charges on the battlefield, the Templars' economic legacy arguably lasted much longer than their military presence. The systems they pioneered influenced European commerce for centuries, shaping everything from banking procedures and estate management to shipping logistics and workshop organization. They set the precedents that future institutions would follow. The Brotherhood proved that their discipline wasn't just for war, it was a form of organizational genius. The same systematic approach that made their cavalry units unstoppable allowed them to coordinate a multinational economy. They successfully integrated their spiritual values with cold, hard business, creating a unique culture that could handle complex operations without losing its religious character. This ability to turn abstract vows into functional systems across different fields was perhaps their greatest achievement. Moving past the grand narratives of high finance and epic battles, we find the daily reality of the individual men inside the order. These were men who had dedicated themselves to a life that was a strange hybrid of a monk's existence and a soldier's career. Their day-to-day lives were radically different from both the cloistered monks in monasteries and the secular knights in royal courts. They combined these two worlds into a unique routine that dictated every action from sunrise to sunset. The most obvious difference was how they looked. Full brothers were instantly engaging in their famous white mantles, which symbolized purity and featured the distinctive red cross authorized by the Pope. Underneath this iconic cloak, however, their gear was strictly functional. They wore simple wool tunics, linen undergarments, and tough leather boots built for work, not fashion. You wouldn't find any of the colorful silks or personal family crests that secular knights loved to show off. The Templars projected a unified, collective identity. This uniformity applied to their grooming as well. The rule of the order was very specific. Hair had to be cut short enough to fit comfortably under a helmet, and beards were to be kept neat and trimmed, never shaved clean like the current secular fashion. These rules served a military purpose while visually separating the brothers from worldly knights who cared about vanity. Seen from a distance, a group of these warrior monks presented a wall of uniformity that was both recognizable and intimidating. Their daily schedule was a rigorous mix of prayer and military drills. The brothers woke up before dawn to the sound of a bell calling them to matins, the first prayer service of the day. After these early devotions and mass, they would break their overnight fast with a modest breakfast. The rest of the morning was usually dedicated to the art of war. They spent these hours maintaining their equipment and practicing formation writing, weapon handling, and battlefield signals. At midday, the brothers returned to the chapel for prayers before heading to the communal dining hall for their main meal. Eating was a solemn affair, following monastic traditions but tweaked for soldiers. They ate in total silence, listening to scripture readings, seated at long tables according to their rank. Unlike traditional monks who often stuck to vegetarian diets, the Templars were allowed to eat meat 3 times a week because the order recognized the physical caloric needs of combat training. The portions were not gluttonous, but they were substantial enough to maintain strength. Afternoon duties depended entirely on where a knight was stationed. Brothers on the frontier might spend hours on reconnaissance patrols or escorting pilgrims through hostile territory. Those at major commanderies in Europe might oversee farm work, train new recruits, or repair fortifications. Others handled the administrative load, managing the books, writing to distant commanders, or counting supplies. Because the organization was so integrated, knights often rotated through these different roles during their careers. As the sun began to set, the community gathered for Vespers prayers followed by a light supper. After Compline, the final prayer of the night, strict silence was enforced until the next morning. They slept in communal dormitories rather than private rooms, resting on simple rope beds with straw mattresses. They owned almost nothing personally. Their clothes, religious items, and weapons were all issued by the order. While this was the standard routine, the environment dictated the details. Brothers serving in the Holy Land faced a much grittier reality than those in peaceful European estates. On the frontier, vigilance was constant, and knights often slept fully clothed and armed, ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. Coastal bases focused on naval logistics, while rural outposts revolved around the harvest calendar. Yet, despite these differences, the core rhythm of alternating between service to God and service to the order remained the constant thread. The monastic side of their life went deeper than just scheduled prayers. It involved constant spiritual practice, including regular confession and guidance from the order's chaplains. The rule encouraged them to contemplate God even while doing chores, turning mundane tasks into a form of meditation. Even their combat training had a religious flavor. Target practice was often preceded by prayers, dedicating their lethal skills to righteous defense rather than personal glory. Training was central to their existence and was far more systematic than anything found in the feudal world. Recruits went through a standardized curriculum, building their skills from basic horsemanship up to complex unit maneuvers. Veterans drilled constantly to keep their edge sharp. While a regular knight might only train sporadically between hunting trips, the Templars treated martial arts as a daily vocational requirement. Caring for their gear was another major part of the day. The rules demanded meticulous maintenance of horses, armor, and weapons. These weren't viewed as personal property, but as a sacred trust necessary for their mission. Brothers spent hours polishing metal to prevent rust and checking tack for weakness. This obsession with maintenance meant that Templars rode into battle with equipment that was in significantly better condition than their enemies. Life inside the commandery was a careful balance between military hierarchy and spiritual equality. While rank dictated who gave orders in the field, the rule emphasized that they were all brothers in spirit. Everyone ate the same food, wore similar clothes distinguished only by rank insignia, and prayed the same prayers. This created a community that had a rigid chain of command for war, but spiritual equality before God. Communication was strictly controlled. Silence was the rule during meals and at night, and idle chatter was discouraged during work hours. However, they held chapter meetings where issues could be raised formally, with brothers speaking in turn according to their seniority. This controlled environment minimized petty conflicts and kept the focus on the mission. Interactions with the outside world were just as regulated. Contact with outsiders, especially women, was heavily restricted. Women were barred completely from the order's houses. When duties required them to go out into society, brothers traveled in pairs to ensure accountability. These rules were designed to protect their moral discipline and operational security, especially since their wealth attracted so much attention. There was no room for secular entertainment. Hunting for sport, attending tournaments, or going to parties was explicitly forbidden. Recreation was practical, such as swimming to exercise the horses or combat games that improved skills. Leisure reading was limited to religious or military texts, avoiding the romantic adventure stories popular with secular knights. Discipline was enforced through a graduated system of punishment. Minor slip-ups, like talking when you shouldn't or neglecting your gear, resulted in extra prayers or fasting. Darker offenses, like insubordination, could lead to whipping or isolation. The worst crimes, those that threatened the order's honor, resulted in expulsion, effectively ending a knight's life as he knew it. Personal letters from the knights give us a glimpse into how this felt. One brother, Ferrand, wrote to his family comparing his new life to his old one. He noted that while his days of vain hunting and displaying finery were over, and his bed was harder and food plainer, his soul had found a peace he never knew before. For many, the strict discipline provided a meaningful structure rather than a burden. The international nature of the order meant that daily life was a multicultural experience. A French knight would live and work alongside brothers from Spain, England, and Germany. While Latin was the official language for church and paperwork, the daily reality was a multilingual community working together. This international atmosphere did more than simply mix languages. It expanded the brothers' minds far beyond the standard medieval worldview as they swapped regional fighting styles, administrative tricks, and practical know-how. Medical care was another huge part of their daily routine. The order ran infirmaries staffed by brothers with actual medical training, offering treatment that was leagues ahead of what a regular knight could expect. They placed a heavy focus on prevention, too, enforcing strict rules about hygiene, water safety, and wearing the right clothes for the climate. These smart health measures were key to keeping the men fighting fit in tough conditions, especially in the East where strange diseases often wiped out European armies. The calendar dictated the flow of life as well. Big holy days like Easter and Christmas brought extra church services and rare chances to feast, as permitted by their regulations. Agricultural commanders shifted gears based on when crops needed sowing or harvesting. In the Northern Territories, winter meant moving indoors to repair gear, sort through archives, and train in specialized skills, ensuring everyone stayed busy year-round while respecting nature's limits. The mental side of life in the Holy Brotherhood was perhaps the most unique part of their existence. Brothers lived with a strange inner conflict, following a monk's schedule of spiritual peace while simultaneously training for brutal combat. They vowed to own nothing personally while managing massive collective wealth. They lived in an all-male environment while serving an order dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Handling these contradictions took a flexible mindset that set these warrior monks apart from both peaceful monks and practical, worldly knights. For new recruits, adapting to this weird lifestyle was often a struggle. The order used a step-by-step initiation process to slowly get novices used to the discipline. Older brothers acted as mentors, guiding them through the tough early days of balancing these conflicting duties. History shows that some men quit, finding the rules too hard, but others found a deep sense of purpose in the structure that they never felt as secular knights. Interestingly, the day-to-day experience stayed nearly the same throughout history, whether the order was brand new or at the height of its power. This consistency created a strong bond across generations, linking knights separated by decades through shared habits. Even as they expanded into banking and governing, the core mix of prayer and protection defined them. They were a hybrid, not quite monks, not quite knights, occupying a third category entirely. Their daily habits mixed silence with battlefield commands, simplicity with efficiency, and humility with power. This reality, more than any big historical event, is what truly defined them. The Templars did way more than just guard roads or defend castles. Throughout their history, these monk warriors joined almost every big campaign to protect or grow Christian lands in the East. Their strict discipline, top-tier gear, and bravery made them crucial assets in Crusader armies that often suffered from bad leadership and mixed skill levels. From huge victories to crushing defeats, the Fighting Brothers were front and center in the era's biggest battles. Their reputation grew fast. By the 1130s, just a decade after getting official approval, squads from the Holy Order were deploying alongside royal armies. The Siege of Ascalon in 1153 was their first major moment in the spotlight. This coastal city was a Muslim stronghold used by Egyptian forces to launch raids. Grand Master Bernard de Tremblay led the charge against its formidable defenses. Reports say a bombardment collapsed part of the wall, creating a breach. The knights rushed to plug the gap, with the Grand Master reportedly leading the way. What happened next is debated. Some say they rushed in alone out of greed for loot, while the Order claimed they were trying to secure a foothold for the main army. Either way, the small force got cut off and overwhelmed. The Grand Master and about 40 knights were killed, their bodies only recovered when the city finally fell days later. Despite that setback, their military value kept growing. Their disciplined troops were vital in checking the rising power of Nur ad-Din, who was uniting Muslim lands across Syria and Mesopotamia. Templar castles blocked his westward path, while their mobile units fought numerous border skirmishes. The Battle of Montgisard in 1177 was perhaps their greatest military hit. Saladin invaded with an army of about 26,000 men. King Baldwin IV, the teenage leper king, could only scrape together a few hundred knights and some infantry. This tiny force included roughly 80 Templars led by Grand Master Odo de St. Amand. Instead of waiting for help, Baldwin launched a surprise attack with the Brotherhood as his heavy spearhead. It shocked everyone. The monk knights smashed into Saladin's unprepared lines, causing a panic that rooted the whole Muslim army. Saladin's forces fell apart, suffering huge losses as they fled through the desert. Christian writers called it a miracle, but also credited the order's fighting skills and leadership. But the win didn't last, as the balance of power tipped back toward the Muslims under Saladin. The Brotherhood took heavy hits in later years, including the capture of Grand Master Odo after a defeat at Margion. Unlike regular nobles who could be ransomed, Templars refused exchange deals. Their policy was victory or death, a rule born from religious devotion and the practical need to stop enemies from seeing them as profitable prisoners. The worst disaster came at the Horns of Hattin in July 1187. Guy of Lusignan, the new king of Jerusalem, ignored advice and marched his army through waterless terrain in the summer heat, letting Saladin pick the battlefield. Sources say the fighting brothers advised against this high-risk move, but obeyed orders anyway. Suffering from heat and thirst, the order and the Hospitallers protected the rear flanks. When the battle started, they launched desperate charges to break the encirclement. Witnesses described waves of white-mantled knights attacking over and over while the main army collapsed around them. By the end, almost every holy warrior there was dead or captured. The aftermath was brutal. Unlike secular knights who might be ransomed, captured members of the Brotherhood faced immediate execution. Saladin personally supervised the beheading of about 200 knights from both orders, viewing them as his most dangerous threats. This mass execution devastated Christian military power in the region. Jerusalem fell months later, ending the First Crusader kingdom. Ironically, this catastrophe made the order even more important. With secular forces wiped out and nobles captured, the military orders, with their independent funding and recruitment, became the last line of defense for the remaining coastal cities. Their castles and ships kept supply lines open to isolated outposts that would have otherwise fallen. The Third Crusade, launched to retake Jerusalem, brought new roles for the Brotherhood. When Richard the Lionheart advanced down the coast, the Templars served as both combat units and cultural guides for European commanders who didn't know the land. They provided scouts, terrain experts, and advisors on Muslim tactics. Richard frequently placed Templar units at key spots in his formations because he trusted their discipline. Beyond fighting, the brothers used their financial network to bankroll Richard's army when funds ran low, and used their language skills to negotiate with the enemy. Their castles provided secure bases for the campaign. This multi-layered support was essential, even though the crusade ultimately failed to fully restore Christian territory. Relationships between the order and other crusaders were often tense. Their battlefield discipline clashed with the glory-hunting style of secular knights, and their local caution annoyed European nobles who wanted quick wins before going home. These tensions sometimes exploded, like when Grand Master Gerard de Ridefort butted heads with other leaders over tactics. Gerard himself was a perfect example of the order's strengths and flaws. During this critical time, his personal bravery was the stuff of legend, with contemporary accounts describing him repeatedly charging into situations that looked entirely hopeless, only to walk away without a scratch while men died all around him. However, his actual strategic choices were often suspect. There were several times, most famously leading up to the Battle of Hattin, where he reportedly pushed the king into that catastrophic clash with Saladin's army. His complicated story highlights the difficult tightrope military leaders walked, trying to balance aggressive bravery with necessary caution. The Fourth Crusade never even made it to the Holy Land, detouring instead to sack Constantinople, which permanently damaged the relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the West. The warrior monks kept their involvement in that controversial disaster to a minimum, as most brothers stayed focused on protecting what was left of the actual Crusader territories. Staying out of it showed their practical dedication to their primary job rather than getting mixed up in foreign politics. While Europe's eyes were wandering elsewhere, the Order kept a close watch along the frontiers that were becoming more dangerous by the day. Later crusading attempts offered fewer victories, even though the religious knights kept showing up to fight. The Fifth Crusade, which aimed at Egypt, started well by taking the port of Damietta with the military orders providing crucial support. But the campaign fell apart in the Nile Delta due to strategic overreach, nearly wiping out the Crusader army during a messy retreat. Throughout that war, the Brotherhood provided specialized troops and tried, usually in vain, to rein in the impossible ambitions of leaders who didn't understand the region. Then came the Sixth Crusade under Emperor Frederick II, who managed to briefly get Jerusalem back through treaties instead of battle, leading to awkward diplomatic deals for orders that believed in absolute victory. The leadership of the Order kept a skeptical distance from these agreements, rightly predicting that they would break easily. Sure enough, Jerusalem fell back into Muslim hands 10 years later. Their caution was proven right, though it caused political friction with the emperor's friends. Through all the ups and downs of the Crusades, the Order was the one constant military force. While other armies arrived and left, their permanent garrisons manned strategic castles all year long, not just during the fighting season. Their ships kept patrolling the sea routes to connect coastal bases, and their spy networks tracked Muslim troop movements even during times of supposed peace. This constant vigilance provided a vital thread of continuity, while Western powers only paid attention to the Holy Land sporadically. Relationships with their Muslim enemies changed quite a bit over this long war. While they were sworn to defend Christian lands, the veteran leaders of the Knights gained a deep understanding of what drove their opponents and what they could do. Unlike fresh European nobles who saw Muslims through simple religious stereotypes, the brothers living there understood the complex politics dividing the Islamic world and adjusted their plans to match. This practical mindset sometimes led to diplomatic talks and deals with specific Muslim rulers when the strategy called for it. The legendary fighter Gerard de Riedfort is a prime example of the Brotherhood's spirit during these hard times. He rose from humble beginnings to become Grand Master. His personal courage fired up the men, even if his battle plans were sometimes questionable. After surviving the horror of Hattin, he was taken prisoner at the Siege of Acre, but was later released, which was a rare exception to how Saladin usually treated captured military brothers. His eventual death in battle sealed his reputation for fearless dedication to the cause. Whether you see him as a hero or a warning about bravery without brains, his life showcased the amazing fighting skills and the potential leadership flaws within the Order. As the 1200s rolled on, warfare changed, and the Order had to adapt from a force built around heavy cavalry. They started using more crossbowmen, expert siege engineers, and light cavalry scouts to support their knights. Their castles got upgrades to handle better Muslim siege engines, adding concentric walls, special slits for crossbows, and complex defenses. This readiness to evolve, rather than sticking stubbornly to old ways, set the warrior monks apart from more conservative armies. The final major military stand for the religious knights happened at the defense of Acre, the last big Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. As Sultan Khalil's forces finished retaking the Crusader lands, the Order's knights were the backbone of the city's defense when the walls were breached in May 1291. Witnesses described the brothers fighting as the last organized group. Their fortress held out even after the city was lost, buying time for some civilians to escape before the building crumbled under bombardment. Grand Master William of Beaujeu was killed leading a countercharge at the end, proving their vow to fight rather than surrender. After Acre fell, the survivors set up a temporary base on Cyprus, launching raids to keep a small Christian military presence alive on the Syrian coast. The very last operation in the east was holding a tiny island called Ruud, just off the mainland. This lonely outpost was overrun in 1303 when Mamluk forces attacked with overwhelming numbers. The captured garrison faced the traditional fate of the Brotherhood, execution instead of ransom, which effectively ended their military role in the region. They had been built to defend. For nearly 200 years of non-stop war, the Order built a reputation for discipline that no other Crusader force could touch. Their unique mix of religious drive and professional training created units that everyone, friend and foe, admitted were elite, from their biggest victories to their last stand at Acre. Their work on the battlefield was the most consistent military effort the West ever made for the Crusader cause. Long after the politically driven Crusades faded away, the brothers kept guarding Christian lands until the very last forts became impossible to hold. The loss of Acre in 1291 closed the book on the Crusader states' two-century grip on the Holy Land. This disaster was just the end result of a long, slow slide that changed the Templar Order's mission and eventually led to their destruction. To understand this collapse, you have to look at how European interests shifted, Muslim power roared back, and internal Christian fighting slowly ate away at the Western presence in the East. The roots of this failure were growing decades earlier, even when things looked like they were going well. After the Third Crusade, Christian lands were shrunk down to a thin strip along the coast, meaning they didn't have the farmland to support themselves economically. This map layout left them permanently exposed, with big cities open to attack from every side. Unlike the Old Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was easier to defend, these broken pieces of coastal land needed constant guarding against enemies who held all the surrounding territory. European excitement for crusading also dropped off sharply during the 13th century. The religious fire that started the First Crusade was replaced by cynical political math. When popes called for new campaigns, European kings ignored them to focus on their own power at home. The crusades that did happen often got sidetracked, like when the Fourth Crusade attacked Constantinople instead of going to the Holy Land. This shift meant Europe was less willing to send money or men east. Earlier crusades had brought emperors and kings. Later ones saw lower-ranking leaders and smaller armies. Louis IX of France was the only real exception, launching 2 big campaigns, but his dedication only highlighted how much other royals had checked out. For the military brotherhood, this lack of interest from Europe caused huge strategic headaches. Their whole system relied on constant recruits and money flowing from the West to the front lines. As Europe looked away, keeping the frontier staffed became harder and harder. Even though the order had its own money, the brothers ended up carrying more of the defensive weight while getting less outside help. At the same time, politics in the Islamic world completely changed the game. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt created a terrifying new enemy for the remaining Crusaders. Unlike past Muslim powers that fought among themselves, the Mamluks were unified under military rulers. Their system of professional slave soldiers created highly disciplined armies trained specifically to fight Crusaders. Under Sultan Baybars, who ruled from 1260 to 1277, the Mamluks launched methodical attacks on Christian lands. These weren't just raids, they were careful campaigns aimed at weak spots. Baybars used his personal experience fighting Crusaders to systematically crush the Order's castles that were once thought to be unshakable, taking down giants like Safed and Beaufort. The catastrophic Battle of La Fourby in 1244 was a dark omen of the end. Sometimes called the Second Hattin, this defeat saw the military orders lose massive numbers of men trying to stop an Egyptian invasion. Grand Master Armand de Périgord vanished in the fighting, likely killed or captured along with hundreds of knights. This disaster broke their defensive power right at the moment when Muslim leadership was getting stronger. Internal fighting between Christian groups only made it harder to resist. The situation grew even more dangerous as intense commercial rivalries between the Italian maritime powers of Genoa, Venice, and Pisa exploded into open warfare right inside the Crusader ports. In the 1250s, the War of St. Sabas in Acre saw Christian fighting Christian in the streets with such ferocity that Muslim onlookers were reportedly baffled by this self-destructive behavior. These internal battles wrecked infrastructure and wasted resources desperately needed for external defense, while shattering any hope of a unified command. The military orders themselves only added to this chaos through their own fierce competition. Although the warrior monks and the Hospitaller Knights were theoretically dedicated to the same holy cause, they frequently chased different strategies and fought over limited supplies when it mattered most. This rivalry made effective coordination impossible, and contemporary records describe multiple failures where joint operations collapsed simply because commanders refused to take orders from a rival leader. As the strategic situation grew desperate, the remaining Christian outposts turned to increasingly risky political gambles, such as seeking alliances with Mongol forces against their shared Muslim enemies. Leaders of the knightly order even joined diplomatic missions to Mongol rulers to discuss military cooperation. Despite the vast cultural and religious differences, these attempts were a pragmatic admission that the traditional crusade methods could no longer stop the tide of the Muslim reconquest. The loss of major inland fortresses forced everyone to retreat to key coastal centers, specifically Acre. This city became the final stronghold of Christian power, housing the headquarters for both major military orders alongside various secular authorities. The result was severe overcrowding and administrative chaos, with multiple groups claiming jurisdiction over the same cramped space, making it nearly impossible to plan an effective defense. However, the massive coastal fortress of Shadau-Pellerin, also known as Castle Pilgrim, stood as a symbol of the Holy Brotherhood's stubborn commitment. Archaeological findings show that the order kept upgrading this state-of-the-art stronghold with the latest military technology right up until the end, holding the line even as Mamluk forces swallowed the surrounding territories. This determined resistance proved they would not abandon their mission, even as the strategic reality became hopeless. The beginning of the end arrived with the fall of Tripoli in 1289. As a vital supply hub and a major facility for the military order, its capture by Mamluk forces under Sultan Kalawan left Acre isolated as the last real Christian foothold on the mainland. Despite this clear warning, political infighting inside Acre prevented any real preparation for the coming siege. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, picking up where his father left off, gathered a massive army specifically to crush Acre. Accounts from the time describe a force of over 100,000 men, equipped with terrifying siege engines including giant trebuchets capable of hurling stones weighing hundreds of pounds. Against this juggernaut, Acre's defenders could only scrape together a few thousand infantry and a few hundred knights from the warrior brotherhood and Hospitaller order. The siege began in early April 1291 with a relentless bombardment of the city's walls. The crusading order launched brave sorties to try and disrupt the siege works, but their numbers were simply too small to break the massive encirclement. By early May, the outer walls had been breached in several places, forcing the defenders into desperate hand-to-hand street combat. As enemy forces flooded the city, Grand Master William of Beaujeu was killed leading a counterattack against the breaches, fighting to the very end. With the city's defense collapsing, the remaining brothers retreated to their fortress headquarters. This final strongpoint held out just long enough to cover a civilian evacuation by sea before the building was undermined, collapsing and reportedly killing hundreds of Mamluk attackers along with the defenders. The survivors escaped to Cyprus, setting up a temporary headquarters to launch raids back at the mainland coast in an attempt to keep a military presence alive. Their final stand near the Holy Land took place at the tiny island garrison of Ruud. When Mamluks captured it in 1303 and executed the warrior monks, the order's original mission was effectively over. The psychological blow of these defeats was devastating. For 2 centuries, defending the Holy Land had been their entire purpose. While the Hospitallers successfully pivoted to a maritime mission based in Rhodes, the Knight monks struggled to find a new identity after such a total loss. Back in Europe, monarchs mourned the loss of the Holy Land but offered little practical help for a recovery mission. Critics unfairly blamed the holy warriors for the collapse, conveniently ignoring that the orders had received barely any support compared to the overwhelming armies they faced. Following these losses, the Brotherhood's focus shifted dramatically to the west. Previously, their European estates served as supply bases for the front lines, but with the front lines gone, the network had no clear military objective. Jacques de Molay, the new Grand Master, drafted detailed plans for a new crusade requiring unity and preparation, but European rulers, now focused on their own internal issues, offered only polite nods rather than concrete aid. The Brotherhood also faced pressure to merge with the Hospitaller Order, a move supported by the Church but fiercely rejected by Molay, who wanted to preserve his order's independence. Meanwhile, they continued to operate as a massive financial corporation, managing estates and banking for royals, but this wealth became a liability as their military justification vanished. Their special tax breaks and autonomy, originally granted to help the Holy Land, now looked suspicious to cash-strapped kings like Philip IV of France. An organization sitting on immense riches with no war to fight was a tempting target, and the loss of Acre left them politically exposed in a way they hadn't been before. Ironically, their downfall wasn't caused by cowardice. Individual knights had fought bravely to the end, but by shifting geopolitical tides they couldn't control. Their discipline remained, but it wasn't enough to stop the political forces now gathering against them in the West. As the 14th century dawned, the military-religious order stood at a crossroads. They had an illustrious past, but an uncertain future. Their mission lay in ruins, and their traditional protectors were losing interest. These circumstances created the perfect opening for secular authorities, particularly the French crown, to seize their wealth. The Brotherhood that had survived centuries of frontier warfare now faced a new threat from the very society they had served. On Friday, October 13, 1307, a secret operation unfolded across Paris with clockwork precision. Royal officers opened sealed orders at dawn and launched a synchronized raid. By nightfall, the entire leadership of Christendom's most powerful military order was in chains, decapitating the organization in one sudden blow. This shock tactic was the work of King Philip IV, known as the Fair. His motivation wasn't religious, but financial. Wars with England and Flanders had bankrupted his treasury. Having already seized Jewish property and debased the currency, he viewed the order's vaults as the solution to his debts. It was a cold betrayal, considering Philip had previously used the knights to manage his treasury and had even hidden in their fortress during the riots of 1306. This arrest marked the start of a tragedy that would transform the sacred brotherhood from a living institution into a historical mystery. Ironically, King Philip IV was setting out to demolish the very organization he had previously relied upon. This prior relationship made his sudden treachery even more shocking, yet this wasn't just about money. It was a cold political calculation. The Templars' unique independence from secular laws posed a major threat to Philip's vision of a centralized monarchy. Because they answered only to the Pope, they blocked his attempts to control every institution on French soil. Their international structure split loyalties, and their special rights established a precedent that limited the king's authority, something Philip was determined to systematically erase. He found the ideal partner for this scheme in his chief minister, Guillaume de Nogaret. This cunning lawyer, an expert in Roman law, had already proven his ruthlessness by orchestrating the daring raid on Pope Boniface VIII at Anagni in 1303. That violent assault, meant to force the Pope to step down, proved they were willing to use extreme measures against the highest spiritual figures when it suited the crown. Now, Nogaret applied that same brutal legal strategy to the suppression of the holy warriors. The plan hinged on accusing them of heresy, the gravest crime in medieval law. By framing the attack as a religious cleansing rather than a political convenience, Philip's government aimed to silence papal objections while justifying the seizure of the knights' assets. The specific charges mixed standard heresy claims with scandalous details designed to eliminate any public sympathy for the accused. Arrest warrants distributed across France painted a picture of an organization that had completely rotted from its original purpose. Knights were alleged to have denied Christ during secret initiations, spat on the cross, performed obscene kissing rituals, worshipped idols, and permitted homosexual acts among members. To back up these sensational stories, the Crown included procedural accusations regarding unauthorized absolution and financial corruption, technical violations that lacked shock value but gave prosecutors a solid legal foundation. The most notorious claim was that they worshipped a mysterious head or idol known as Baphomet. Scholars still debate the term's origin, with some suggesting it was a corruption of Mahomet, implying Islamic influence, while others propose connections to Gnostic traditions or pagan symbols. The vague, mysterious nature of this charge made it incredibly effective, allowing accusers to portray the crusading brotherhood as secret devil worshippers hiding behind a facade of Christian piety. The timing of the strike was perfectly coordinated. On the designated morning, royal officers throughout France opened sealed orders simultaneously, giving the military order zero opportunity to hide their assets or organize a defense. Grand Master Jacques de Molay, who was in France to consult on a new crusade proposal, was seized along with his top officials at the Paris Temple. In just a few hours, members of the religious brotherhood all over the kingdom were thrown into dungeons. Their properties were secured by royal agents, and their records were confiscated for inspection. This lightning-fast action presented Pope Clement V with a fait accompli. The French-born pontiff, who owed his election to Philip's influence, only received news of the arrests after they had already happened. This tactical move prevented papal intervention that might have protected an order that answered directly to Rome rather than secular authorities. The king's representatives justified their haste by claiming that defending the faith required immediate action, presenting the Pope with evidence that supposedly confirmed heresy within the ranks of the warrior monks. What followed was medieval Europe's first systematic use of torture in a major political prosecution. Knights of the Holy Order, while accustomed to the hardships of the battlefield, were unprepared for judicial brutality. They faced professional torturers employing techniques designed to shatter both body and will. Men were strapped to devices to dislocate shoulders and arms, while others had their feet roasted over fires to inflict excruciating burns. Sleep deprivation and starvation weakened their resistance over long periods. These methods produced the confessions royal prosecutors needed to validate their accusations. Even Jacques de Molay eventually broke under these conditions, admitting to some charges while denying others. His statement, extracted after prolonged torture, provided crucial propaganda value for Philip's government. Royal publicists ensured this confession received widespread attention, undermining potential sympathy for the imprisoned brothers. The spectacle of the order's supreme leader admitting to corruption seemed to validate even the most extreme accusations against his subordinates. The application of torture appears to have been nearly universal among the arrested brothers. Historical records show very few members of the Brotherhood in French custody managed to maintain complete denial through the interrogation process. Most eventually confessed to a subset of the charges, typically admitting to ceremonial acts like denying Christ or spitting on the cross, while rejecting the more elaborate stories of idol worship or immoral practices. The fact that these confessions followed a similar pattern but varied in specific details strongly suggests the statements were extracted under extreme duress rather than being coordinated lies. Pope Clement found himself in an impossible position. His theoretical authority demanded he protect the sacred order from secular interference, but his practical dependence on French support limited his ability to challenge Philip directly. Furthermore, his own background in southern France, where recent suppressions of Cathar heresy had shown the dangers of religious corruption, made him susceptible to the idea that even prestigious organizations might harbor secret apostasy. Attempting to regain control, Clement issued the bull Pastoralis Preeminentiae in November 1307, ordering all Christian monarchs to arrest members of the order within their territories. This directive effectively legitimized Philip's initial illegal action while expanding the investigation across Christendom as a church-sanctioned inquiry. Clement hoped to reassert papal authority over the proceedings while showing appropriate concern for potential heresy. However, results outside of France proved significantly different. Edward II of England initially resisted the arrests before eventually complying. When members of the Brotherhood in England faced interrogation without torture, which was illegal under English law, virtually none confessed to heretical activities. Similar patterns emerged in Aragon, Castile, Portugal, and German territories, where interrogations conducted without French-style torture methods generally failed to substantiate the sensational accusations. This geographical pattern, where confessions correlated exactly with the use of torture, suggests the fabricated nature of the charges within France. Extended imprisonment and judicial pressure eventually broke even the most resistant brothers. Recognizing the existential threat to their organization, leaders of the warrior monks attempted various defensive strategies. Some argued on legal technicalities regarding proper procedure, while others claimed confessions made under torture were invalid. A few managed to escape and disappear into the countryside or neighboring lands. Most, however, remained trapped in a judicial system designed to produce predetermined conclusions regardless of the facts. The prosecution faced unexpected challenges when some imprisoned knights recanted their confessions once the initial torture ceased. In Paris, a group of defenders emerged, willing to represent the Brotherhood against the charges, arguing that procedural violations invalidated the entire process. This resistance prompted renewed torture, with Philip's government determined to maintain the narrative of guilt regardless of evidentiary problems. When dozens of brothers persisted in defending the order, authorities resorted to permanent silencing methods. On May 12, 1310, 54 knights of the Holy Order who had recanted their confessions and volunteered to defend the organization were burned at the stake as relapsed heretics in a field outside Paris. This mass execution dramatically demonstrated the consequences of challenging the royal prosecution. Subsequent defense efforts collapsed as remaining brothers recognized the futility and mortal danger of resistance. The message was unmistakable. Confession offered the only path to survival. While the legal proceedings continued through elaborate formalities, the practical dissolution of the religious knights advanced rapidly. Royal administrators inventoried and assumed control of properties belonging to the Brotherhood throughout France. The extensive banking operations, agricultural estates, urban facilities, and accumulated treasures fell under crown management. Though the official fate of these assets remained technically undetermined during the trials, their effective transfer to royal control happened immediately following the arrests. The Council of Vienne convened in 1311 to address the question of the military order alongside other church matters, demonstrating Clement's continuing ambivalence. The assembled church leadership reviewed evidence from various regions, revealing the inconsistent results between territories using torture and those following traditional procedures. When several hundred representatives of the Brotherhood unexpectedly appeared offering to defend the order, the Pope suspended proceedings rather than allowing a direct challenge to the French narrative. Philip forced a resolution by personally traveling to Vienne with a substantial military escort, effectively intimidating the council into compliance. Clement, recognizing he could not resist French pressure, issued the bull Vox in Excelso in 1312, suppressing the warrior monks through administrative authority rather than formal condemnation. This technical distinction allowed for dissolution without definitively declaring the entire order heretical, a face-saving compromise permitting the Pope to maintain some appearance of independent judgment. A subsequent bull, ad providum, allocated most properties of the Brotherhood to the Hospitaller order rather than secular authorities. In practice, however, This transfer was incomplete, particularly in France, where Philip retained substantial portions of the wealth through claims of administrative costs and debts allegedly owed to the crown. The practical outcome aligned with the king's financial objectives, while maintaining nominal adherence to the principle that religious assets should remain in religious hands. The final act in this tragedy centered on the fate of Jacques de Molay and Geoffrey de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy, who had been held in extended imprisonment. Throughout the lengthy proceedings, until March 1314, the Grand Master and his companion were brought before Notre Dame Cathedral for the public announcement of their sentences, life imprisonment. Based on their previous confessions, what followed stunned onlookers and precipitated the final tragedy. Standing before the assembled crowd, both men suddenly recanted their confessions, declaring the Sacred Brotherhood innocent of all charges and attributing their previous statements solely to torture. This dramatic reversal left church officials in disarray but prompted an immediate response from Philip, who declared the pair relapsed heretics. Without further judicial process, that same evening, the two leaders were burned at the stake on a small island in the Seine. Maintaining their claims of innocence as the flames consumed them, legend records de Molay's final words as a curse upon those responsible for his unjust execution. He summoned both Philip and Clement to meet him before God's judgment within the year. When both the king and pope died within months of the execution, Clement from illness in April and Philip from a hunting accident in November, many contemporaries saw the fulfillment of this prophetic denunciation. This dramatic conclusion cemented the story of the Holy Knights in the popular imagination, transforming judicial murder into the stuff of legend. The suppression represented a watershed moment in European power relations between secular and religious authority. A monarchical government had successfully destroyed an international religious organization despite its direct papal protection. The legal mechanisms employed, particularly the use of heresy accusations to justify property seizures, established dangerous precedents for future deployments of judicial power against inconvenient institutions. The realization that sufficient brutality could force confessions to support any specific narrative exposed deep flaws in the judicial processes of the Middle Ages. For the thousands of surviving brothers located outside of France's immediate reach, the suppression caused a massive personal displacement. Men who had pledged their entire lives to a religious calling suddenly found themselves stripped of their institutional identity in most regions. They were generally granted small pensions funded by their former estates, usually on the condition that they lived in other religious houses where they could be watched. Their iconic white mantles vanished from sight. Their communal lifestyle ended and their shared mission dissolved, not because of a defeat on the battlefield, but due to an administrative decree. However, the dramatic shutdown of the Knights Templar was not truly an end, but rather a transformation. Although the organization stopped functioning as an official entity, its influence has rippled through the last 7 centuries of history, folklore, and culture, ranging from successor groups to banking methods, and from stone monuments to popular myths. The legacy of these warrior monks lives on across many different areas of human experience. The immediate fallout of the suppression varied wildly across Europe. While the French crown succeeded in its goal of seizing massive assets from the military brotherhood, other rulers took different paths. In England, Edward II dragged his feet, but eventually followed the Pope's orders, handing over most of the religious knights' properties to the Hospitallers as officially required. The kingdoms of Iberia showed particular creativity in handling the transition. In Portugal, King Denis negotiated the formation of the Order of Christ, effectively keeping the organization alive under a new name with the same personnel. This shift of property and essential structure received the Pope's blessing in 1319. This Portuguese continuation would later play a crucial role in maritime expansion during the Age of Discovery. Under the leadership of Prince Henry the Navigator, who served as governor of the Order of Christ, their vast resources backed Portuguese voyages along the African coast and eventually across the Atlantic. Ships displaying the Order's cross, which evolved from the emblem of the Holy Brotherhood, carried explorers to new continents. The navigational skills, honed in part during the Knight monks' earlier sea operations, contributed to these voyages, helping to redefine how Europe understood global geography. In Spain, the resources of the Sacred Order were split among several successor organizations, including the orders of Montesa and Santiago. These military fraternities continued to defend Christian lands against the remaining Muslim strongholds on the Iberian Peninsula, eventually aiding in the final conquest of Granada, which completed the Reconquista. Similar handovers happened in scattered territories throughout Europe, with local politics dictating the terms rather than a standardized shutdown process. The Hospitallers, who were the main beneficiaries of the estates once held by the crusading knights, expanded significantly after the suppression. Their later defense of Rhodes, and subsequently Malta, against Ottoman expansion represented a continuation of the crusading spirit that had driven the warrior brotherhood throughout their existence. Many former castles and commanderies simply swapped management, while keeping their original defensive roles under new administrators. The architectural footprint of the military religious order remains visible in buildings all over Europe and the Near East. Their unique round churches, designed to resemble the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, still stand in London, Paris, Tamar, and other cities. Massive fortifications they constructed still dominate landscapes from Syria to Scotland. These physical ruins offer a tangible link to their historical presence. While archaeological teams continue to dig up new facts about their daily operations at these widespread sites, the financial innovations pioneered by the Order's administrators survived long after the Knights were gone. Their banking practices shaped the emerging Italian banking houses that grew international finance in later centuries. The record-keeping methods, credit notes, and trust systems they created became standard tools for European commerce. The very concept of an international banking network offering standardized services across political borders, first fully realized by the Holy Warriors, became a cornerstone of modern financial systems. The legal attacks against the religious brotherhood set grim precedents that were repeated throughout later European history. The use of torture to get confessions that fit a predetermined script reappeared in later witch trials, inquisitions, and political purges. Accusing groups of heresy to justify stealing their property became a recurring tactic when authorities wanted to eliminate wealthy organizations. These procedural tricks represent perhaps the bleakest part of the warrior monk's legacy, as techniques of persecution were refined during their suppression. Almost immediately following their dramatic end, the public imagination turned the history of the Knight monks into legend. The story of Jacques de Molay cursing his persecutors, which seemed to come true when both King Philip and Pope Clement died within a year, captivated medieval audiences and established a narrative of unjust persecution followed by supernatural payback. Rumors flourished about secret survivors escaping to Scotland, Switzerland, or remote islands, taking hidden treasures and arcane secrets with them. These myths hit home in Scotland, linking the Holy Knights to the Battle of Bannockburn, which was fought just after their suppression. According to tradition, knights fleeing French persecution provided crucial help to Robert the Bruce, aiding in his decisive victory against the English. Even without contemporary historical proof, these stories forged a lasting bond between the mythology of the religious warriors and Scottish national identity. This was later reinforced by claims connecting them to Freemasonry. The Masonic fraternity, which went public in early 18th century England, incorporated themes from the military order into its symbols and rituals. High-ranking degrees in some Masonic systems explicitly claim descent from the warrior brotherhood, painting the medieval order as guardians of secret wisdom preserved within Masonic traditions. While serious historians find little evidence of a direct organizational link, these associations firmly planted the image of crusading knights into Western esoteric traditions that still influence spiritual movements today. Modern pop culture has further exploded the presence of the Holy Order in our collective mind, appearing in everything from Indiana Jones to Assassin's Creed, and from the Da Vinci Code to countless novels. The knights in white mantles have become universal symbols of medieval mystery and hidden knowledge. Their dramatic story, from humble roots to immense power and a tragic crash, provides an irresistible structure for storytellers across all media. This cultural afterlife has arguably spread their fame far wider than their actual institutional achievements ever did. Academic historians continue to find new angles on the history of the religious knights through archival discoveries. The recovery of transcripts from their trials gives us insights into medieval judicial procedures and political maneuvering. Excavations at sites once occupied by the military brotherhood reveal details about their daily routines that documents alone cannot show. Comparative analysis, placing them within the broader history of religious military orders, highlights both their unique traits and the features they shared with similar institutions. The lasting fascination with the history of the warrior monks reveals deep trends in Western cultural consciousness. Their story captures the fundamental tension between religious ideals and practical power, between institutional authority and individual commitment, and between mystical spirituality and martial discipline. These contradictions, embodied in the paradoxical figure of the warrior monk, continue to resonate with audiences trying to understand how spiritual values interact with real-world realities. From 9 knights pledging to protect pilgrims on dangerous roads to an international institution controlling vast resources across 2 continents, their journey demonstrates both the potential and the peril of organizations that mix religious motivation with worldly power. Their rise proves how focused purpose and disciplined structure can achieve amazing institutional growth. Their fall illustrates how accumulated wealth and special privileges inevitably attract predatory attention from rival powers. The legacy of the knight monks ultimately goes beyond the hero worship of fans or the cynicism of critics. Their real historical significance lies in multiple areas: military innovation, financial development, architectural achievement, and organizational design. They pioneered international structures in an age of fragmented local rule. They developed practical solutions to complex logistical challenges. They showed how religious values could sustain organizational discipline across diverse environments. 7 centuries after Jacques de Maillet's execution, the cross on the white mantle still holds powerful symbolic resonance. Whether viewed as examples of religious dedication, victims of political persecution, pioneers of international banking, or guardians of mysterious wisdom, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon continue to occupy a unique position in history. Their remarkable story, from humble beginnings through extraordinary growth to dramatic suppression, remains a key chapter in understanding how medieval society organized its highest ideals and confronted its deepest contradictions. The final irony of the history of these religious warriors may be that an organization created to defend physical territory ultimately achieved its most enduring influence through intangible legacies. Institutional models, financial innovations, architectural principles, and symbolic resonance. Long after the walls of Acre crumbled and the temple fortress was demolished, the organizational patterns they set and the imagination they sparked continue to influence how we structure our institutions and understand our past. The legacy of these warrior monks extends far beyond the territories they once defended, entering realms of history, legend, and cultural memory they could never have anticipated during their 2 centuries of existence.